I've been wrong for 15 years about this, so you shouldn't listen to a word I say. Single subjects are almost by definition anti-complexity. If you're just taught one narrow thing and you turn up somewhere, that thing doesn't even exist, and you don't even know how to begin to engage them, you are going to be lost and you're going to be left behind. The world has got more complex now than it has been for a very long time, perhaps forever. Our lives, what tech is going to do, what AI is going to do.
Do you think then that the traditional university models are at risk of becoming obsolete? Carl, thank you ever so much for joining me on the International Classroom podcast today. Whereabouts in the world do we find you?
Hi, Alex. Thanks. Yes, I'm in London. I'm in North London, a place called Finchley, which used to be Mrs. Thatcher's constituency. I'm not sure. Some of your older listeners may remember her. Anyway, it's a very nice part of London, sort of suburbia, but great schools, quite nice green. And I'm here this morning, but then I'm heading into my university for the last afternoon of term and look at some student presentations.
Amazing. We're going to dive into sort of your educational journey in a little bit. But how would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners and to our viewers today?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Well, obviously, I'm pushing 60, so intros can go on a bit. But basically, currently, I'm the Dean of the London Interdisciplinary School, which is the first university for about 50 years, really, since Warwick, to get its own degree awarding powers at its inception, which is... Well, first, it's very difficult to do, which is why it's only been done once in half a century, because the regulatory barriers are so high, and usually you have to offer the degrees of another uni before you're given your own the stabilizers are taken off. But we were able to achieve that, I think, through the quality of our mission and the originality of our mission. So the UK government was keen to see innovation in the university space, and we are very serious about that and serious about doing that in a original and quality way. So I'm the dean of this amazing project. I've been on payroll there for nearly 6 years now and been involved about 7 years as a consultant initially. And before that, I set up the first Bachelor of Arts and Sciences in the UK, which is not that different to the American liberal arts system, but it does have some peculiarities. And in the UK system, it was completely unique. So we had to change the title of degrees. You can get a BASc now in the UK, a Bachelor of Arts and Sciences, not just arts and not just sciences. And you couldn't do that before that degree was set up at UCL, the great uni in London, which I led the team for from 2010 to 2019. So that's probably enough background. There's a whole literally life or two lifetimes before that, involving opera singing and various other activities. But maybe that's another podcast, Alex.
Well, that's the thing. I was doing my research, and that's what I've got in terms of background. We've got mathematician, physicist, opera singer, philosopher, and now you've mentioned the leader in the interdisciplinary education. That's a fascinating journey. And do you think, those numerous threads have connected in some way to help shape your educational leadership approach?
Yeah, 100%. Firstly, I would never claim to be a mathematician or a philosopher. I've got degrees in those things. Some of those degrees were quite good, but I never researched in those areas. So I'm qualified to teach, at those levels, but I wouldn't classify myself as that. I was a genuine opera singer. I earned my living as a singer for a few short years, the late 90s, early thousands, and I was the Royal Opera House Scholar to our National Opera Studio, which is the elite postgraduate course in the country. So that I really was as a career. But yeah, absolutely. So I kind of wandered around a bit. I was never really a slacker in the sense I was always studying something or really trying to learn new things. But it took really almost into my 40s for all this to come together in a way which then seemed suddenly very contemporary. And a lot of it was to do with the internet, honestly, and the way connections started to be made so easily and quickly, and quite surprising connections across different subject areas, different careers. And I'd been sort of doing this all kind of struggling myself, but all together being interested in so many different things. And suddenly all these books started to be being published about a new renaissance happening, about polymathy coming back. There's a term, the neo-generalist, books were published on that. And by that stage, I was working at UCL. I was head of their international foundation courses, but that's quite a small concern since it's not regulated, it's not part of the main offer of a university. And this opportunity to lead this new Bachelor of Arts and Sciences at UCL came along. And I think, my bosses at the time just thought, well, this guy's kind of very different. He's not a traditional academic. He's got all these kind of strings to his bow. He can talk to lots of different people. So that, as you're sort of hinting, that the leadership piece is really important here. Let's give him a go. I like to joke that, I was a bit of a nobody, so if it failed, they could blame me for being useless. And if it was a success, everybody kind of won. So, in fact, they were great to me. You see, I really, they made my career. I'm very, very grateful. But in a way, I'm sort of both a high-risk and a no-risk candidate. But anyway, absolutely, the ability to talk to many different people, to genuinely appreciate all the arts and the sciences, be interested in politics and economics and everything, was very, very important to my ability to lead these programs.
So thinking about that, was there a specific moment in time, maybe whether it's between obviously doing the opera or whether you're studying for those numerous degrees that you've mentioned, was there ever that specific moment that kind of made you go like, aha, this is what I want to be doing. This is now the path that I need to be following?
No, not really. As I say, I was, in a funny way, although I was, in my early 40s, I was sort of, I think, at the front of a wave, which I see now everywhere in sort of portfolio careers, people finding interesting niches which their parents and their teachers often don't understand, new careers in things like digital health, AI and law, sustainability. These careers didn't exist 20 years ago, sometimes even 10 years ago. And so I was able to kind of lead a program where I saw all these new combinations emerging as possible, and other people really didn't understand that they were about to happen or happening. So it was kind of luck. I'm not sure I'm quite answering your question, but it's kind of luck that I was at the front of that wave. But it was never planned. But when it all came at once, kind of settled in place in me. And I was like, wow, my life, which has seemed like a lot of wandering, trying to put things together, is actually what kind of also when Web 2.0 started happening, all those connections that we got through social media, all the networking that was possible. It's like my life has been, without my intending to, completely set up for this moment. In a way, you could say, yes, it was a moment, but it was like complete luck. And, it would have worked at other points in history too, by the way. Maybe during the Renaissance, that would have been very suitable to me. But we've been through a long period of industrialization, specialization, things I think about a lot now. Basically, from the Industrial Revolution to the sort of computer revolution, it was all about narrow specialism and types of professionalization. And that all started to break down in the thousands. And I was this guy who was like, oh, yeah, that's the way I like to work and see the world. And now I can help other people kind of retool for this new wave of history that's kind of happening.
It's very much like Malcolm Gladwell when he talks about outliers, and he talks obviously about Bill Gates, and everyone going, oh, it was luck. And it was like, well, reality was actually he put himself in a position where he'd done all of these different things. He'd found passion projects. And at the time when the world switched, he was at the forefront and able to take advantage of that. So it sounds very much like it was that for you. You had just acquired all these skills through interest, through passion. And when the world changed, you were then at the forefront with the skills that we wanted and required. And that kind of nicely takes us on to this part about interdisciplinary, what we kind of danced around as we've been describing there. It's like your pioneering parts about interdisciplinarity in terms of the university that you work at. But I'm interested from your side, like, why do you think interdisciplinary thinking is so crucial for the future of education?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So I think the world has got more complex now than it has been for a very long time, perhaps forever. And that's due to two things. One is the connectivity. You might say the kind of over-connectivity, just the number of possible connections we can make through the media, through travel and all sorts of things. And the other is the speed of that. Both those things complexify the world enormously. And somehow, if we're going to operate in this world at any kind of level of professional work, influence, basically sort of any kind of white-collar job, we're going to have to be people that can work in that way and understand this complexity. And single subjects are almost by definition anti-complexity. What you're trying to do is reduce the world to one fairly narrow academic vision of that world. And that just doesn't fit anymore. It's simply too rigid. So to think a bit more in terms of metaphors, the dominant metaphor of our age is the network. We talk about networks everywhere, social networks, political networks, computer networks. A network has both a structure, because it's nodes that are connected, and it's incredibly flexible. It can be squished in one way. It can have various forms. And our education is totally different. It's basically sort of columns, if you're lucky, which support some kind of lintel, or you might think of it as boxes, whatever it is not a network. And we need to think of ways of educating and thinking, which is much more like a network, because that maps onto the real world we live in and actually mirrors our careers much better. So if you like, you can start from that quite abstract visual principle, but nevertheless, that's very powerful in informing how we should be learning and the sorts of things we should be teaching, how we teach certain things, how we connect them, how we make that relevant to the real world. That just doesn't work if you do 3 degrees of English literature, or even sometimes 3 degrees of 3 years of English literature, or 3 years of law. Even the professions, engineering, medicine, and law, are changing massively and continue to change. And unless we recognize that and educate in a more interdisciplinary way across those professions, the people we're educating are losing out, and they're not going to be properly prepared for their lives and their careers.
The way you described it there kind of made me think of concept-based, when we have the three-dimensional learning. So obviously you've got the pillars that provide foundational knowledge, and then you've got concepts and overarching questions building, obviously.
I'm just looking for this book, Alex. I don't know if you know it, concept-based learning. Is that something you're familiar with?
Yeah, it is, very much so.
Okay, I won't find the book, but it does sound close to that. And I was very impressed by that book.
It was great. I think it was is it a female Australian author?
Yes,
I think she's,
that's right.
we have, so for like the NYP delivering there, it's very similar to that, but it's a skill, and with that there often comes skepticism, and it's a challenge because we talk in education nowadays about breadth of knowledge and depth of knowledge. So how do you ensure, from your side, if you're approaching, let's say, one interdisciplinary learning, that students are getting enough breadth as well as then enough depth of knowledge to make these connections?
Yeah, I mean, our first thing to say is I think it does depend a bit on the age group. I think interdisciplinary learning works best with very small, young learners, I should say, and then with university students and perhaps even older university students. So I have had a lot of success at undergraduate level, but the first year is often quite painful as the students kind of repurpose from their very narrow experience they've had into thinking of something more flexibility, more connected. I do think it's a challenge at secondary level, partly due to human development and what people need in terms of structure at that age, partly due to legacy, the things we talked about, but also partly because they need to have some basic skills in some things in order to be able to make meaningful connections. So, and I know, we might work in different spaces in that way, but I think that's important to recognize. I'm not one of these people that steams into schools and says, why aren't you all doing discovery learning all day long? You've got to be able to do some basic algebraic manipulation, mathematics or coding, got to be able to write reasonably well, all the basic stuff. But let's assume if can I just talk about my university stuff? That's
Please,
the thing I know about. Yeah. So, for me, this comes down ultimately to what we think expertise is and what is worth learning. And we've got stuck in a rut because of these 200 years of sort of industrialization, professionalization, of thinking that an expert is somebody who has a degree in something with a certification saying, BSc in biology or LLM in law. And in fact, most graduate jobs now require you to be much more of an expert in a thing. So it might be, app-based health for retirees or something. So your focus or how certain industry might get better at meeting the sustainability goals. So your expertise is much more centered on an object of doing something in the real world than an academic discipline, which has basically 200, 400, 500 years of history and all the knowledge you're supposed to learn to get that expertise. And it's a cliche now that graduates emerge from degree X and say, I can't use any of this degree in my job. It's completely useless. It was all right at the time. I found it interesting, but what has it got to do with the job I'm supposed to do in my drug company or in my media company or in my political organization, whatever. So it's much more about saying to depth, this is the key word, depth, or even rigor, is much more about understanding the thing that you're studying and then thinking, what do I need to really know to be a deep expert in that thing? How much coding of Python do I need to know? How much user experience do I need to know? How much do I need to understand about focus groups? How much do I need to read a bit about, conservative politics or whatever it might be? there's a whole mixture of quantitative, scientific, qualitative skills and knowledge you need to be an expert in many, many, many areas of modern life. And sustainability is a classic one. It's partly science, it's partly social science, it's partly politics, architecture might come in, all those things. But we ask the wrong question. We say, how can you be an expert if you don't have a degree in, one thing? That's the wrong question. The wrong question is, how can I become an expert in the real things that people are doing in the real world, and then work backwards from there? And the programs that I set up basically gives the foundations, and then the optionality for students to pick the particular rigorous methods and skills they need, be it in data science, be it in visualization, be it in economics, whatever it is, to actually focus those skills and knowledge on something that they're really interested in the real world. So it does require some intellectual maturity. It requires some choices, some trade-offs, but it doesn't allow students to say, I'm just going to sit here and get my degree in whatever, international relations and then work out how to be an estate agent when I graduate. It does require them to say, okay, I'm interested in being this when I graduate. What do I need to put together to do that? And there's a graduation. The first year is obviously a lot of exploration, some foundational stuff. Second year, we start to say, okay, well, what choices are you making and why? And by the third year, we hope to give them a bit more of a clear platform about the options they have after they graduate and how they can become an expert, how they have that depth, to go back to your question, in something real, rather than just assume that depth comes from studying one particular discipline.
You're the second university sort of professor lecturer that's also mentioned that first year of almost breaking down the A-level mindset of how students think and approach it. I was speaking with Jason Gullier, who's a professor at Berkeley, and very much into AI, and he's English. It's like a literature, so writing side of things. And he said, that first year, you literally are breaking down students. You are deprogramming them from how they have just been basically ingrained for the years, through that years of education. And it's interesting when you talked about expertise there, that the analogy, the £10,000 bill, you probably heard this one, where the plumber comes along and it's like, fixes this problem within 10 minutes and charges the company £10,000. And this guy's like, how is this possible? Yeah, it. And it's like, well, it's the £100 call out and it's £9,900 for knowing where to tap. Yeah. It's that when we talk about expertise, don't we? It's like the building up of an acquiring of almost through experiences. We have to be able to give students experiences with that. And it's interesting. We as educators can sit here and be out and go, you know what? Interdisciplinary versus siloed, as we've discussed, is the way forward. I call it skill stacking. But there's got to be some challenges in this. You've got to be challenges. You've got to convince students. You've got to convince parents, even sometimes maybe convincing employees. How do we go about that? How do we convince them that, an interdisciplinary degree, an interdisciplinary way of thinking and learning is the way forward?
Yeah, I mean, this is very, very hard, Alex. And honestly, I wish I'd had more success at this. I mean, the UCL degree is a great success. It's got 180 intake a year, which puts it on a par with medicine and the biggest programs at UCL. LIS has been more challenging to recruit undergrads to because we're brand new. We don't have that label of UCL. It's solid. It's small at undergraduate level. The master's level has been a surprising success. We've gone from 0 to 60 intake in 3 years at masters, which is superb, and perhaps also goes back to that thing about the maturity and seeing that the world is complex and you need complex skills in it. So perhaps that attracts older learners slightly more. I think. Yeah, I mean, the way I've done it, and it's not been massive, universally successful. Otherwise, these sorts of degrees would be more widespread. I think is tell stories of individuals, and you hope that you can tell enough stories, enough variety of stories that any sort of student can see themselves in one of those stories and think that could be me. But the legacy we're fighting here, the legacy of, back to Adam Smith, actually, in specialization on conveyor belts, people think that's the way the world is and has to be. And it takes a lot of work, which, you can't even get over in a 1 hour webinar. You have to kind of recommend books like this book called The Polymath by my colleague Wakas Ahmed that traces points of history where a range of skills have been much more valuable than just one narrow skill. And there's a whole section which he traces, like whenever you go to any Terra Incognita where you don't know what's going on, obviously you need a range of skills to understand, to do the best you can. You know, rock up on a desert island. It's no good if all you know how to do is build a hut. You have to be able also to get some fire, to do some hunting and so on. So the thing here, again, I'm not saying this is going to convince anybody, but I'm telling you, Alex, because you're interested in the world we're moving into now is very much a terra incognita in terms of our lives, what tech is going to do, what AI is going to do, and so on. It's not the same. There isn't much business as usual, particularly in more advanced capitalist economies where our students are. So what do you need in a terra incognita, an unknown land? So I should explain. An unknown land. What do you need there? You're going to need a range of skills, even to start to be able to negotiate that space. If you're just taught one narrow thing and you turn up somewhere, that thing doesn't even exist, or there are 50 other things you also need to know about, and you don't even know how to begin to engage them, you are going to be lost and you're going to be left behind. So you can make these kinds of arguments, and I've got great statistics too. So there's a fantastic organization called the Institute for Student Employers. Highly recommend their work. Beautiful research. They look after all the graduate employers, or they research them to see what they want from their incoming new employees. And the data on that, or the connection between the degree you do and what a graduate employer wants, is more or less completely broken, and has been for well over 5 years now, in the sense that 86 to 90% of graduate employers don't care what undergraduate degree you've done. That's their word. They don't care. That's quite strong language, which just shows you that it doesn't matter what you study at undergraduate level, because it's irrelevant to what you do as a graduate, right? So if you sort of start from this sort of negative baseline and say, okay, if that's true, why do I think I need to study economics to work in a bank? It's just not true. The data says it's not true. So you can study anything. But then let's be more positive than that. Let's think, how could I tool myself up to be a really good modern economist? I should certainly probably also know some politics. I should probably know some data science. I might want to know something like human psychology. And then you start to get this more interdisciplinary picture. But I mean, just the very fact that I can't give you a one-line sentence, Alex, shows you how challenging this is. And people want simple answers. People want reductionists. They go, yeah, but I want to, how am I going to do this job? And you have to say to them, firstly, the job isn't the same. Secondly, there's other ways to do the job. And people find it very hard to think outside the boxes of lawyer, doctor, engineer, when there's a tiny fraction of the jobs our graduates are actually going to be taking.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Because I was going to ask you in terms of, and you may have already answered it, into what do you think the biggest misconception is? And especially when we talk about like LIS, when you're speaking with people, what is it they misunderstand about the mission that you're on?
I think the big thing is the expertise, the depth versus breadth. They sort of worry that they're not going to get something deep and rigorous, because they have this misconception that depth and rigor only comes from academic subjects that were established anything between 50 and 200 years ago. And you could say, well, it's true, but you also won't get depth and rigor in horse riding at LIS, because we don't ride horses anymore in the world, or falconry. We don't do anything on falconry, because we don't need to be flying falcons anymore, right? But academia has somehow made this pitch that English literature is a completely made-up degree, right? It was made, I think, in the early 20th century, largely by a few Americans and some Cambridge dons. And one academic said, why do I need a degree for books I read on the train on the way to work anyway? But English literature is now kind of, that one of the kind of pions, is that the right word, of kind of rigor and disciplinariness and kind of scholarly excellence. Nothing wrong with English literature, by the way. I'm very much for people studying whatever they like. My whole pitch has been that we've got trapped into thinking that these very narrow subjects are the only way, and we have well under 1% of sort of really interdisciplinary options. Let's increase interdisciplinarity tenfold to 10%, and you still can have 90% of disciplines, but you're going to have way more students with better options for them and for their careers if you did that. But I do think the breadth versus depth thing is very difficult to challenge conceptually, and you need examples of students that have gone on to these careers in things like digital health, sustainability, startups, all the things where interdisciplinarity leads you very naturally. And then you just have to keep kind of reassuring the students that they're learning really useful, interesting stuff. And it doesn't matter if it doesn't have a label that says psychology or biochemistry.
Yeah. I even find in lower into the school as a secondary school teacher from 11 all the way to 18, it's kind of like we start with great breadth, and as we get older and older and older, we seem to streamline what it is that students can do. And every sort of system is different. So the IB, you could say, helps to keep that breadth that we want. And A levels actually kind of goes, actually, no, we only want you to specialize, but we want more depth. And I feel like we are doing students a disservice. And we mentioned some of the things about the skills. We even the terra firma part you mentioned was a great analogy to utilize there about, if you're in an empty space, as kids are with games, like even Minecraft games that you see them on, and they're having to build up and develop civilizations, and they're thinking about the resources they need. They're thinking about the space they have. Those skills that they are using and the trains of thinking they're having is applicable to the real world. And, I'm really interested in this for my own children's sake. My eldest is 11, and we're kind of like in 8 years' time. She starts year 7 in September. 7 years' time, she's going to be off. Do you think then that the traditional university models are at risk of becoming obsolete?
So I like to say this, Alex, and maybe this is a sign that I'm big enough and ugly enough to be confident enough to say this. I've been wrong for 15 years about this, so you shouldn't listen to a word I say. I mean, when the massive open online courses came along, the MOOCs, right?
Yeah.
I was like, well, surely this is the end for education, because anyone can learn exactly the same things at home for free with much better teachers from Stanford, MIT, Berkeley, Oxford, Cambridge. Why would you spend 50 grand a year, basically? 50 grand in total, maybe a bit more, 60, 70 grand, basically going somewhere, not turning up to lectures, getting drunk, and coming out with something that I was completely wrong. That's actually what people want to do. So I miss, because I went, actually, funnily enough, back to history, but I went to uni quite late. I went when I was 25, just going 26, because I did this first stint as a pianist at the Guildhall School of Music. So when I went to uni, I was so thirsty and hungry to learn, and it was before the internet, so I used to write down my questions on a pad, like on those thick-lined A4 pads, and have like 12 questions or 20, and there was a 1 hour office hour with the professor, and I'd line up outside the door, and like, can we get through these questions? If the internet had been around then, I would have just been absorbing it, doing all the free courses online, and I'm so envious of the students these days who actually really just want to learn stuff for stuff's sake, because the internet is just this paradise, unimaginable. But because I did that, I think I underestimated how much of a social and cultural rite of passage university is for young people, which has very little to do with actual learning as me as an intellectual teacher would like it to. And I'm not blaming them, because in a way that's the last great rite of passage we have in our society. We don't really do confirmation or religious things very much anymore if we're in the sort of majority communities. Of course, some other communities do. And this is the moment where people become adults. And so I've seen remarkably little change in universities over the last 10 years, considering the rest of the world. It's amazing. And we keep saying now universities are bust. Attendance at universities is terrible in lectures now. It's well under 25% in many classes, because the students say, just record the lecture and send it to me. Fair enough. That's a valid thing. But then why do we have to turn up to lectures as professors and pretend we're doing something we're not? There are just so many illogicalities, inefficiencies, and frankly nonsenses in the sector. And the fact, as we said, that what they're actually studying is irrelevant to the next stage of their life. But it carries on. It carries on in, amazingly strongly. Now, every year or two we say, now is the crisis. Now is really the crisis. The latest one has been the international students that may be cut off due to our new immigration policies. That perhaps really could be different this time, because they are the only things in the entire sector. I'm not sure if your audience will know this. They're the only things that make any profit in the university sector. Without students, and mostly Chinese students, universities are continually structurally making a loss every single year. And obviously that's unsustainable, literally. So maybe this time it's different, but it hasn't changed at all for a decade, to my enormous surprise.
No, you're right. I mean, this is why for us in the Middle East, you're seeing certain universities open up here. Because those types of international students can get visas to come here. Which is an interesting one. But it's very interesting. I was very fortunate to speak with a gentleman called Hugh Viney. who is the founder of the Minerva online school.
Oh, I know Ben a little bit, the original founder.
Yeah. And we were talking about that, and obviously what the work they've been doing, and the just the sheer numbers they've got coming through. And now again, Ofsted recognise and Ofsted really praise them for the types of things they're doing, and the pastoral care, because that was always the biggest concern. The pastoral care, if you're on an online school, how do you do that? But with the advancements in technology, and now with AI coming through, and that these systems are showcasing actually what you can do, and it's a learn anytime, anywhere type of thing. And they still have a traditional day to some extent as well.
They're very rigorous actually in what they require in attendance and engagement. They are very hardcore on that element. It's
something that universities could really, and although the Open University has been around for a long time, you could probably see certain universities really getting on board with that. And it's going to take a period of time, but it's still that focus on, and I've got this here, is about, like we said, employability, the balance of making students useful. And that's really the challenge, is it? And, if we're still focused on, and parents, and it's my generation of parents now coming through and slightly older, with their students, their kids, and going, right, it's focusing on employability. What are you going to do? Right? How do we balance then making students useful whilst also trying to maintain that love of learning that you yourself went through when you went to study?
Yeah, it is a great question. I think it's quite polarized, both in individuals and in the sector in this respect. And I really like the fact that students stubbornly resist every government push to churn out more STEM graduates, and they keep going for arts degrees or supposedly useless things like gender studies. Good on them. The youth should always do that. The reality. There are multiple realities, right? So if you come from a very underprivileged background, you are more likely, with all the right reasons, to be focused on getting into the middle classes and getting the money to do so. Not universally, but that, I think, is more of a feature when people come from very underprivileged backgrounds than it is from middle class kids. They don't have the luxury of thinking in that way. But nevertheless, they are young people, and the world is very complex, and our biology has changed far, far less than the world has in the last many thousand years. And so they're wrestling with all this stuff that we all went through, like who am I, what is my sexuality, what do I really care about, all these things. And so education is always going to be a very important part of them becoming rounded human beings. I mean, what I've tried to do in my programs is marry those two things and say that the best way to find out about yourself is to find something you care about that's external to you, that you want to start to dedicate yourself to. And I don't think we do this enough for young people, actually. I think our mental health provision has been diabolical the last 10 years, and I think it's evidenced by the fact that mental health is getting worse and we're chucking more and more at it. What we're doing is clearly not working, and we're doing more and more of the same. So something needs to change. I'm not quite sure what, but one thing I would say, and we know from the evidence, is that a key to happiness is trying to do something outside yourself, be useful to other people, help other people, care about other people, do something for other people. And university can and should be doing much more in their curriculum, which requires students to do that.
Yeah, it sounds very similar to we were talking about recently is the Japanese moral education. Had a really interesting chat with a guy called Charlie Jenkinson, who specializes in lots of international, but focusing on the Japanese moral education system and how they break down sort of self and then service and the environment and what they're doing for the community in that respect. It's a really interesting take, and more educators I listen to and more I speak to who have that viewpoint on that sort of almost like character development. And we talked a lot about that. But there's a couple of things you picked out there and I want to really get your insight on, because you talked obviously about your program and we're talking about change a lot here. So this one's more of sort of a reflective question, but if you could redesign the education system starting from scratch, like what would your version of it look like?
You know what? I haven't actually thought about that big a question for so long because I've been so focused on starting this new university and the sort of parameters and constraints around that. But I think, so I've got two kids. One's 20, one's 17. And you know what it's like as a dad. You do and you don't have influence on them. Sometimes they do. Often they do the exact opposite of what you want. And sometimes things get through which you are surprised and are happy to see. But I think one thing that's becoming absolutely essential now with AI is for no matter how old you are, this has to start tiny, understanding what constitutes valid, authoritative evidence and what that means for all the, what we say in grown-up language, knowledge claims are about the world. We are now, as you know, at a stage where kids will type into ChatGPT and get an answer and think that's the truth. I mean, that's just one level on and one level worse than using Google search 2-3 years ago. So the fundamental thing education has to teach, I think, is where knowledge comes from and why. And that could start with, do you remember those lovely work with bees that this academic did with primary school children in the West Country a few years ago, doing some research around bees. Anyway, I had little primary school kids in little groups working on basically science, but doing science with local bees and kind of hypothesizing and testing and all sorts of things. You have to somehow get children and then all the way up to understand that all the knowledge we have comes from somewhere. Some of it is nefarious. Most of it isn't. Most of it is driven by people who are just curious and want to do better for the world. But some of it's wrong. Why is it wrong? All that stuff from the very, very basic who to trust in the world and why, right up to kind of scientific reproducibility in psychology and economics seems to me more important than ever now. Authority is being challenged like never before for all sorts of reasons. And the age where we would just trust academics or politicians has really, really gone. In some ways, that can be really healthy because it's a democratization of everything. But what that means is you have to teach everybody in that democracy where knowledge comes from and why we value it in the way that we do. So that is quite a radical rethink, actually. I think about this a lot with respect to AI, and I encourage my students to use AI all the time on my course at university. And some students resist it, some students hate it, they're not ready for it. But I say that because the baseline has gone up so much that it's so easy to produce pretty good work with a push of one button. All the value on now is how you evidence the content of that work and why I should trust what you say is in that work and show me that you understand the data you looked at that went into that piece. So I think that requires an entire rethink of what we do.
Yeah, that rings true with a lot of things I speak to my students about. We talk a lot about authenticity. And we say that you're in a generation now where any piece of work you produce, be it digital, someone is always going to question the validity and authenticity of whether it's yours. And that's a challenging part. And I like what you said, because it almost goes back to this concept again of concept-based learning about acquisition of knowledge and acquisition of process. And again, where are we getting that information from? And it's one of those, I think years gone by, you would always have said, whatever the teacher, you took what the teacher said as golden. You would never question it. You was always, sir said this, that must be right, therefore. Now it's like, I always remember the Homer Simpson part, and he's hugging the TV. It's like, TV wouldn't lie to me. Let's never fight again. And then you fast forward to this year and you're talking about, right, let's look at the US election with Kamala Harris, of what she posted in one state versus then what she posted in another state about her viewpoints, I think it was, on the Middle East wars and Middle East conflict. And there were two opposing points based at what we know about what that demographic wants versus what that demographic wants. And it was generated. It was AI influenced and generated. And it's scary, super scary for the kids. But you're right. I think from my side as a scientist, trying to get them to think analytically and almost be skeptical of anything they see and question that. I mean, I always remember there was an article that came out in a science publication that said milk causes cancer. And it was published in that, and you really have to deep dive into the evidence and without being analytical. And I say this one because my wife is like probably many individuals, that 3 billion people on this planet get their news from social media. That's one of the facts. 3 billion people news from social media. That's TikTok and Facebook. So my wife came up to me a while ago and she was like, "Did you know that women need more sleep than men?" And in my head, I'm thinking, I can get behind that. And then I just said, where'd you come across this? This is, she went on Facebook, and I instantly shut it down. I was like, because, and this is the thing, all our students, all these parents will go, and I always regale stories like, did you know, I saw something on social media? And that's when most students start there. Oh, sir, I saw, and my kids do it, and I don't know if yours are the same. They'll come up to you and tell you a fact. Like, Dad, did you know that such and such does that? And I'm like, oh, okay, where'd you come across that? TikTok. Oh. Yeah. And it's like you say, that value of knowledge. How do we know where and what is actually right. It's a challenge. It's a big challenge we face now, isn't it?
It is. I don't know where you start with younger learners, because some of it is pretty technical. You know, how do you understand the difference between one statistical presentation and another? And some of it is so hard just to do. Like you say with the AI now, I mean, how could even URI really know whether something was AI generated or not without understanding all sorts of watermark things and so on, which I don't really understand. I know they're just being proposed. So the skepticism is key, I think. And then I don't know what happens if you teach young people just endless skepticism. Do they just get very cynical and a bit kind of manipulative straight away? And that's bad too, right?
Yeah.
But I think we've got to try, because otherwise the pitfalls seem to be worse somehow.
I agree. And I think it's one of those, we would rather try and look back and be able to adapt rather than not try and look back in hindsight and go, I wish we'd have done this. So thinking about that, as we draw this to a close, and it's been a fantastic conversation. I really, really do appreciate it, Carl. What is one takeaway that you would hope our listeners, educators, parents or students can take from our conversation today?
Okay, you might have to stop me or edit me. I think everybody needs to understand some science and something which is more from the arts or the social sciences. I think that's fine for IB students, and maybe they don't even need to hear that. But for A-level students and many other students around the world, there's still far too much division between those two things. And I don't think you can really understand the modern world without understanding how much we're driven by science, increasingly tech, and all the science behind it, the algorithms of what data is, what statistics is, or how humans behave, and how humans aren't machines and they aren't scientific and they're very irrational and they have all sorts of biases and problems, and you have to negotiate that and understand that. So the economy will never be a machine, despite what they teach you in economics. But equally, you can't live your life as a human being without understanding how science works and how it drives so much of good in the world as well as problems. So that's one thing I wish every educated person will get right up to graduate level. And just one more, I think, is connection making. Always seek to make connections. Don't artificially divide up what you're doing. And in fact, work in the opposite way. Try to seek connections between one thing you're learning and another thing. That's a habit you can form, and it's a useful habit, and it will help you in having a more rounded view of the world and being more useful, I think, in whatever organisation or project you're involved in.
Amazing. Thank you. And for those people who maybe are interested in learning more about the London Interdisciplinary School, where can they get more information?
Yeah, so thank you. We have a very nice glossy website. There may even be some videos of me on there. Oh, heaven help me. But we are at the London Interdisciplinary School.org on the internet. We're also on Instagram, but I'm not, so I couldn't tell you much more about that. So I'm on X and Blue Sky, but that's my social media limit. Thank you very much. And I'm on WhatsApp, of course, which is also too much. So yeah, London Interdisciplinary School on the internet or on Instagram or on LinkedIn. LinkedIn, we have lots of nice serious posts, so that's a good place to start.
Amazing. Well, Carl, thank you so much for having that discussion with us today. I think generally enriching and lots of things, key things for us to go and think about for educators in terms of how we're shaping our curriculums. And I think also for parents about, how the type of child they want to raise, I think is probably the one thing about that thing that sticks out for me is, employability versus useful. Would you rather have an employable child or a child that's useful? And I think for me, moving forward into the world that we live in, it's going to be some interesting conversations.
I've got one of each, Alex. I wish you the same as well. I've got one who wants to be a very narrow engineer and one who's a generalist finding his way in the world, and they're both wonderful, and I'm sure they're both going to be successful.
The same. I had a conversation with one the other day going, Dad, do you reckon I should go to Harvard or Oxford? And the other one who's just like, la 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 la. And, they're both happy as long as that, then we're all good. We're all good. Well, Carl, thank you again. I really appreciate it. You enjoy the rest of the day, and